code update, zoning code update project in Charleston. We are going to, we have released and been placed on the website code assessment document. And what we are going to do tonight, myself and Jeff Green, and then our other colleagues who are all the technical, so we're going to highlight the key points in the assessment. We also have put boards up on both sides of the room. There are 5 key themes and goals that come with the assessment. And actually, in chronological order, starting in the far corner to my left to your right, is the first theme, and we just go through the first 3 themes here, and the other themes are over on the other side of the room. We're going to, Jeff and I are going to take about 35 to 40 minutes to, we have a PowerPoint presentation to cover the key points that have been made in the assessment. We'd like you to hold questions until the end. We'll take questions, and then after that, we will be, our team will be at the boards. Anyone who wants to come up and ask us additional questions on a more informal basis. So that is the process, and it's great to have you here. So we can go ahead and get started. In terms of where we're going, I'm just going to take a minute to introduce we've got we have a big team, and we have a number of our team members here tonight. I'm going to talk quickly about the work program to sort of let you know where we've been, where we're going. I expect this is about a 2.5-year process, and then Jeff and I are going to review the key themes in the code assessment. And those of you who haven't looked at the code assessment, actually, this is the cover of the assessment. Okay, in terms of, next slide. In terms of the team, and we have 6, Clarion Associates is a prime consultant on the project. We have 6 sub-consultants. I'm not going to go over all of them. I would like to introduce the team members that are here tonight. Jeff Green, who is principal of Clarion. Gordy Moore is also a colleague of ours, associate. Amy Grove is with Denver Cole Partners, and they are working on the form-based codes and are going to assist on design-related issues for the project. Margaret Philippine is here. She's also with DKP. And Kelly Casino is actually in the back. And she's with White and Smith, and they are working with us on the procedures and also serve as the legal counsel for the project. So those are the team members that are here. In terms of the work program, I mentioned undertaking a development code or zoning code update on a comprehensive basis is a challenging project. It's a big project. It has not been done in Charleston in over 50 years. Your code is quite old relative to the codes that we have worked on over the last 30 years in our firm. So one of the things that we have learned and that the city has set out is a very systematic process to go through this update. There are 5 tasks. We are in the 2nd task. We began 3 or 4 months ago. We had a number of meetings. We hold there's the community advisory panel, there's a technical advisory panel, there's your planning commission, elected officials, staff. We conducted a public meeting. We also conducted surveys on the website that we have for the project. I'm asking the question, what are your current concerns or problems with the current regulations, zoning regulations? And what do you think need to be achieved in this update process for you to believe that it has been a successful process? In addition to that, the consulting team, also reviewed and evaluated city plan, your recently adopted comprehensive plan which gives very, I think, direct policy direction on some key issues that are important to the update process that haven't been addressed in your current regulations. So that process took several months. We then went to the second step, and that is this code assessment, where we synthesize those key themes or goals we heard from the community. And then we explained them. We did an evaluation of how the current regulations address them or don't address them. And then we made some suggestions in terms of how to address them moving forward. And now we have released that document. The document is for everyone in the community to review, and then we're here to sort of get confirmation from you that, yeah, we're right, or no, we're not right, which we need to make changes. So that's what the purpose of this process is. And once we get that input, we'll then start the actual, what I call heavy lifting in task 3, and that is actually drafting the code document. We're doing it in installments, meetings on those. After that is after we got the entire code updated, drafted the code updated, then we will go and we'll test it to make sure actually on the ground test to make sure it's achieving what the goals of the project were. Once that's done, we refine it and then we can go to the public hearing process. So that is the work program. That's where we are headed. We are in the second task, headed toward moving toward the third task. Next slide. I'm just going to highlight for those of you who aren't aware, there is a website for the project. The web address is over on the right. Please look at it. If you haven't, there's a lot of good information. This code assessment is on that website. Go ahead. Next slide. With respect to the code assessment, which Jeff and I are now going to cover, next slide. As I mentioned, it is organized basically into four parts: an introduction, a diagnosis, where the goals are outlined, an annotated outline, which is a proposed outline of the new zoning ordinance. Next slide. There are 5 key themes. I'm not going to cover each one of them here, but Jeff and I are going to review each of these individually as we move through the process. The first theme is very straightforward, and that is to make the updated zoning code much more user-friendly than your current regulations. Because the current code is over 50 years old, it is not that well organized. The current regulations have not taken advantage of a lot of advances in software technology, so you're not using graphics, photographs, tables to communicate zoning concepts, and the language can be clarified. So what we recommend 4 or 5 things to make it more user-friendly. Create the structure that is more logical, add graphics and tables to make the code graphically rich, improve formatting of the document, and include more precise language. Next slide. This is the proposed reorganization. There will be 9 articles. It really focuses on 3 major concepts in a development code. First is procedures, and that will be Article 2. Second are your zone districts and use regulations, Articles 3 and 4. And then the development standards, which are Articles 5, development standards, and 6 subdivisions. Those are the key components of the development code. The current regulations, while there is some organization, there are many instances when you will find some development standards in the zone, or you will find other zone district provisions that are integrated into the development standards and things of that nature. The The other issue that I think is very important to making the code more user-friendly, next slide please, is this idea of integrating photographs, cables, and three-dimensional drawings in communicating zoning concepts. This is an example of a zoning district from a code that we have done relatively recently that just shows you this is the direction we are suggesting in the assessment that the Charleston code moved in. We can talk about this in more detail after the meeting and show you some examples on the board. But that is a great example of how the code can be made much more user-friendly. Turn it over to Jim.
Thanks, Craig. As part of the user-friendliness, one of our recommendations, as Craig showed you a couple of slides ago, was to consolidate all of the different procedural parts of the code, rezonings, variances, BRA hearings, all into one section of the zoning ordinance. And we propose that in Article 2. The benefit of this is that it allows you to consolidate all of these different provisions that are very similar in one section of the code, which makes it easier to use. One of our recommendations is that we include a summary table at the beginning of the administration section, which sets forth clearly each of the different types of development review applications. And for each of those, it says who is, which review body is involved in the process. Is it a decision the zoning administrator makes? Is it a decision that requires city council approval? So by looking at this table, and that's actually included in the code, that's our proposed set of reorganized development review procedures, you can tell exactly which bodies are going to be involved in the review, whether there's a public hearing involved, whether there's multiple public hearings involved. It's all in this one table. Another key, Gordy, could you go back?
Yeah.
Another key recommendation is to have standard procedures for all development review types. So there are many different procedures which have very similar application requirements. There are procedures which have notice requirements. There are procedures which have public hearings. And these all, for multiple types of applications, you have these, sort of standard procedures. And so we propose to have a section on these standard procedures. And what that does is it helps make sure that you have consistent procedures between different types of development applications. We've done that in other codes, obviously customized to the different types of procedures in each community. For example, Charleston has a much stronger design focus in a lot of its regulations. And so we will make sure that we incorporate the important provisions in these standard procedures. But we also have, for individual application types, if there are different types of procedures, we'll go ahead and include those in a separate section as well for each procedure. There's a lot of other I'll call them sort of small tweaks. We want to make sure that it's clear what landowners need to do if they want to get an approval. We want to make sure we know what each development review body, whether it's staff, whether it's the BRA, whether it's the ZBA, whether it's city council, to understand what the decision they're being asked and how to make that decision. We also recommend adding, and we have a lot of detail about this in the assessment, a little bit on the board over there, adding some additional procedures to help streamline and make more efficient the development review process. Next slide. So theme 2, update and modernize the zone districts and use regulations. Craig talked about one key part of that, which was reorganizing the way the zoning districts are laid out to make it easier for people to understand the purpose of the zoning district and what type of development is intended in that zoning district, as well as the key dimensional and other standards that apply, setbacks, height, things like such as that. But we have also gone through and taken a very close look at all of the more than 100 zoning districts in the city with an eye of modernizing and streamlining them. Another key goal was to accommodate the development that's called for in the city plan. The city plan was adopted just a few years ago. It was a very sort of broad effort to engage the community into determining the direction of the city. And there's a lot of direction in there for the types of development that the city wants to see. And that's what we looked at. That was really part of our guide, along with talking to members of the community, talking to stakeholders, talking to staff, in developing our recommendations. One of our key recommendations is to establish a separate set of residential and mixed-use districts for the Lower Peninsula, for the historic part of the city. The reason for that is not because we think it's more important or because we think areas outside of the peninsula are less important, but there's a very different development form. You know, the historic areas in the Lower Peninsula have been around for hundreds of years. They were developed, you know, centuries before cars were created. And so there's a very sort of dense urban fabric, very walkable, that's very different, not only from much of the city, but really from much of the rest of the country. And so we thought it was appropriate to have a separate set of districts that can better accommodate the types of infill and redevelopment that you see in that area. Next slide. And I'll go into a little more detail on that in a moment. Obviously, one of the key issues facing Charleston is rising water levels. And so the city plan, as well as the land and water analysis, has a lot of recommendations around how the city should address that. One of the key is to direct development to those higher elevations. So people want to move to Charleston. Charleston's continuing to grow. But to make sure that development is directed to those higher elevations which are less at risk for flooding. Another city plan goal is to allow more types of housing throughout the city, as well as to increase incentives for affordable housing. And we've also, we have taken a close look at the standards that apply in the different districts and have general recommendations about changes that we can make, both to improve resiliency and also to improve equity, to make sure that the dimensional standards are realistic and that they're addressing the issues that need to be addressed. Next slide. So again, as I mentioned earlier, we're proposing two types of residential mixed-use districts, one generally for off the peninsula as well as the upper peninsula, and then one for the historic areas. That recognizes the historical development patterns in the lower peninsula, but it also allows us to better adapt district standards to the rest of the city, so that you don't have. Some of the benefits of that is you're not trying to craft districts that can accommodate both the very dense, walkable environment in the Lower Peninsula, as well as the more suburban style of development in some of the other parts of the city. And at the same time, you can allow development to take place on the Lower Peninsula without having to have quite so many variances and making it a lengthy development process. There will continue to be some districts, institutional districts, that will apply throughout the city. Next slide. So this is our recommended set of districts for the Lower Peninsula. You'll notice that we're proposing to consolidate some of the districts, some of the single-family districts and the single two-family district. The goal there is to meet the goal of the city plan and permit additional types of housing. So these districts, this Lower Peninsula residential low district, would not only allow single-family houses, but also duplexes. We have some additional recommendations in the interest of brevity. I'm not going to go into great detail. These three boards over at the end on the right side of the room go into detail of all the zoning district changes. And so, we'll have a little question time after the presentation, but then we'll be over there and answer any questions you have about the district. We also recommend some changes to the commercial districts. These are mostly just sort of, we like to have a consistent nomenclature. And there will be some adjustments that we talk about in greater detail in the conversation. Next slide. These are the recommended zoning districts for outside of the Lower Peninsula. I'll just talk a couple of the highlights. So we are recommending that several of the single-family districts and some of the lower intensity diverse residential districts be consolidated into this residential mixed-load district. And this will, again, this is related to the city plan goal of allowing more housing options in more parts of the city. Again, as I mentioned, Charleston has a lot of districts, and we think there's an opportunity to streamline them and consolidate some of the districts as we're recommending here. We have some of the same sorts of mixed-use districts off the Lower Peninsula as we do in the Lower Peninsula. I'll just mention, best practice generally these days is to have office uses within general commercial districts. So that's one of the things that we're recommending. The form-based overlay districts. So we'll sort of quickly go through these slides. Again, we have a board over here, and our colleagues from Dover Cole can talk with you about those. But form-based districts, generally speaking, focus more on the design of land rather than the uses. Most of the traditional zoning codes, so-called Euclidean zoning codes, really focus on uses. But these are designed to sort of take a very design-heavy approach in these areas. These are areas that were chosen for analysis based on what the city plan says, and these are all areas where the city plan are generally at higher elevations, where the city plan calls for increased development. There has been a lot of planning work done in these areas as well. Plan West Ashley, Rethink Follow Road. And so these are all, we're looking, as part of the assessment, we're looking at 3 different areas for these form-based districts and proposing to move forward with up to 2 of them. So we very much would like your input on these. So again, we'll very quickly go through these. This is the first one along Brittburg and Savannah Highway. Next slide. This is out on Maybank Highway. There are 3 of the future land use areas nodes that are city center, which is where some of the highest intensity development is intended. And then finally on Johns Island along Folly Road, includes the area that's part of the Rethink Folly Road scheme. Overlay districts. The city has a lot of overlay districts. We're proposing to carry forward several of them. These include the accommodation, the short-term rental districts. Charleston's a huge tourist attraction, and we think it's important to keep those to appropriately manage that, as well as the districts related to the historic parts of the city. Next slide. We are recommending getting rid of a number of other overlay districts. Part of some of these districts, the regulations will be incorporated elsewhere into the zoning ordinance. We think they don't need to be overlay districts. We're not proposing to get rid of landmark properties or the protections that apply to them, but we don't believe that it needs to have a separate sort of section in the zoning ordinance. And we are recommending some changes to the design review district. We're still discussing that with staff about how that's going to look. One of our recommendations is to have some more measurable standards for design to help, again, make the development process a little more efficient. Next slide. There are several other districts that are in the code. We think that we've come up with a lineup of zone districts that can accommodate the types of development that meet the goals of the city as expressed in the city plan and in our discussions. These are districts that we would consider to be legacy districts, so they would still be in the code. If you have land zoned to one of these districts, you could continue to develop in the same way, but they would no longer be available to be assigned to new properties. So you couldn't apply for a rezoning to the Gathering Place district or the urban commercial district. Next slide. Finally, we'll do updates to the use regulations. You all have a set of uses that's based on the standard industrial classification, which was last updated, I think about 40 years ago. And so we'll go through, review all of the uses, add new uses as necessary, clean them up, make sure every use has a clear and precise definition that's included in the zoning ordinance. A lot of your current uses are undefined. You need to look elsewhere to see what they are. We'll add use standards. So again, as part of the reorganization, all of the use standards will be organized in the same section. The goal is that there's a use table that's easy to use so that you can see at a glance where uses are permitted. Next slide. And I'm going to turn it back over to Craig to talk about the next thing.
Thank you, Jeff. The next theme deals with an issue that is new. It was embraced in city plan. It is based upon the fact that over the past couple of decades, if not longer, there's been a very slow increase in running water, which has accelerated in the last decade. So it's projected to continue, become more frequent, seems to be a lot more flooding. In response to that, the city has conducted a number of water analysis and other studies related to the water environment. They're identifying the plan. Bottom line is that the city plan estimates that there will be about a 3-foot increase in sea level levels by 2080 over the next 60 years. It's going to result in a lot more flooding. It's going to result in even increased flooding in higher elevations. For this reason, one of the real key or core principles of the city plan is to address this issue of a rising water environment in a way that makes the development practices in the city much more resilient. Next slide, please. City plan, in terms of understanding, I think, the background for the recommendations in the city plan that are recommended to be implemented with zoning regulations, is first to understand that the city plan based upon water analysis. They organized the current environment into 4 basic zones. One was high ground, that's for areas that are outside the 100-year floodplain and also are not impacted by storm surge during a Category 3 hurricane. The next category is the adapt zone, which includes land. It's outside land, outside the 100-year floodplain, but land that is impacted by storm surge in the Category 3 hurricane. In the compound flood risk zone, which are lands that are within the 100-year floodplain, but are lands that are not in this tidal flood risk zone, which is the highest risk area in the community. This tidal flood risk zone basically are any lands that are 7 feet or below in terms of sea level. And those are the areas that are the greatest impacted. Those are the areas that the expectation is there will be marsh migration into these areas with a 3-foot increase in sea level. So there's the high ground, which is the area that is least vulnerable. There's the tidal flood risk zone, which is the most vulnerable area, and the 2 zones in between. Next slide. Just to give you an idea of where these areas are, this is a map of the city. You can see in the dark green areas are the high ground areas. The dark gray area, like the light gray area, are the tidal risk areas. Along the tidal risk, tidal flood risk zone areas, there's a fair amount of high ground also in these areas. Next slide. In addition to that, city plan also identified what they call strategies to deal with develop strategies in terms of thinking about how development practices should be rethought in these areas. There were 4 strategies. One is grow. Those are the areas that city plan recommended we focus on for the highest intensity densities of development. Those are the high ground areas, the least impacted, the least at-risk areas. The next concept was defend. And in terms of what the city plan was talking about, defend was focus on protecting buildings and infrastructure in these areas with engineered measures and other techniques. And these are really the other 3 areas, the adapt zone, the compound flood risk zone, and the tidal flood risk zone. Then the other strategies were adapt, retrofit the infrastructure in the community, deal with the rising water environment, and then finally something the city will call reserve. And that is to take action actions to preserve natural systems that can help absorb water as water continues to rise. That would apply in all the zones. Next slide. In addition to this evaluation of environmental risk from rising water, city plan also identified 12 land use categories. And the most relevant land use categories to this issue of rising water were the city center land use category, and the neighborhood edge land use category, where in the city center, where the highest intensity mixed-use development should occur in the neighborhood edge, which would accommodate neighborhoods serving commercial, residential uses at densities from 6 to 20 units an acre. That's where those are areas that are basically in the high ground area. And then another designation that is relevant is low impact conserved area. And this is the land use designation that was applied to the tidal flood zone. In other words, the areas of land that are at greatest risk. And then there's also a natural wetland area, which are basically wet areas. In addition to these categories, these four, there were another 8. Next slide. And this is just a map that shows you all of the 12 land use categories and their location in the city. Let's go to the next slide. But this is the map that shows the location of the neighborhood edge and city center land use designations, which are the areas that were identified for the highest density growth, generally the high ground areas. Go to the next slide, and then we have a final graphic that shows, that overlays the high ground, which is the darkest green gray area, over the neighborhood edge and city center areas. Now, I will note to you that in terms of developing the land use category, there were other considerations. For example, in instances where the local peninsula, the recommendation for a R in that area, you can see that there is a city center designation. But generally speaking, the neighborhood edge and the city center designations line up with this high ground area. Next slide.
Excuse me, would it be possible to speak closer to the mic?
I'm sorry.
Would it be possible to speak closer to the mic, please?
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll just pick it up. I'm sorry.
Thank you,
What's
sir.
up? This is a graphic that shows, I talked about the low impact conserved areas and the natural wetland areas, but this is a map that shows where the low impact conserved and natural and wetland areas. And these graphics are on the maps. They're also, we have a copy of this PowerPoint presentation on the website if you're interested in looking at this more closely. Next slide. In terms of the recommendations that are in the city plan for regulatory action, I think the first thing, before we're talking specifically about regulatory actions, we want to note that the city has already taken a number of steps to address this rising water environment. Number one is they have increased, the base flood elevation requirement in special flood hazard areas to 2 feet above base flood elevation. What the FEMA requires is just above base flood elevation. So buildings in the 100-year floodplain are going to have to be 2 feet above base flood elevation. The city went through a very extensive analysis and developed a updated, strengthened stormwater manual in 2020. As of this year, there has been a prohibition on using slab and grade foundations in the 100-year floodplain. In the special flood, any other special flood hazard areas. And then there's also an UP upper incentive system in place. What in addition to that is recommended in the city plan? First of all, the city plan recommends that there be created a new low-impact zone district that aligns with this low-impact conservative area designation, land use designation. And in that area, it is proposed that densities be uses, the type of uses allowed in that area be reduced, that density intensities be reduced, that the regulations be developed that would support flexibility provisions that allow for enhancement of natural systems so that the natural systems would work to absorb some of the flooding in the water that comes with the rising water environment. And then, in addition to that, they recommend that the zoning districts developed which would allow for higher density, intensity, mixed-use type development in the high ground area, which would be the city center land use designations and the neighborhood edge designations. And the assessment basically identifies three different additional districts that would do that. And then, in addition to that, they would suggested that there be the incentive programs for affordable housing focus in this high ground area also. Next slide. And finally, and this is not recommended in the city plan, but this is a recommendation that is made in the assessment, and that is that in all of these areas that there be an establishment of what is called a resiliency index, which basically all new development would have to comply with, possibly some redevelopment, and that basically it would be a point system, and a developer would have to earn a certain number of points, and it would basically give the development applicant different options to score those points, but the focus would be on reducing flood risk in a number of different ways, or improving upon stormwater management practices even above and beyond your current manual. The assessment also recommends new standards be developed for visual compatibility, as buildings are going to have to be elevated more. And also finally recommends considering a transfer of developer rights program to deal with any type of reduced uses and density reductions in the one area of the community. Theme 4 is addresses this concern about affordable housing. I don't think that anyone in the community, or very few people, if any, would say that there's not an affordable housing issue today in Charleston. Bottom line is that housing costs in the last, between 2011 and 2021 have increased by 50%, while income levels have increased by 31%. I mean, there's an increasing number of people in the community who just can't reasonably afford housing. Next slide. So city plan recommends 2 specific actions with respect to addressing the affordable housing issue. One is to encourage and diversify or incentivize a diversity of housing types in the community. The other is to allow for or strengthen the affordable housing incentives in the community. Next slide. With respect to the recommendation on diversification, let me say one of the things that it is outlined in more detail in the assessment is we looked at your current zoning regulations, and the bottom line is that zoning regulations basically allow for single-family detached homes just about any, in most of the districts, but there are real strict limitations on where other types of housing can be built. In fact, excuse me, I can say it is one of the stricter codes in terms of just supporting single family versus not allowing other housing options. So one of the things that the assessment recommends is to allow for a much greater diversity of affordable housing types. That would include triplexes, fourplexes, mansion apartments, courtyard apartments, cottage courts, live work units. I mean, basically missing middle housing. There are also some specific, the assessment also recommends that these types of uses be allowed in some of the specific districts. I'm not going to list those. With respect to the Affordable Housing Incentive Program, there are a number of incentives today for affordable housing, but you've got just some affordable housing built. So, and this is not an easy issue in terms of, there is no silver bullet answer, but one of the things that these affordable housing incentives are in a number of different places. They're not consolidated. There are differences in the requirements. So the first thing that we're recommended in the assessment is that you consolidate all the affordable housing incentive provisions into one section of the code. And in addition to that, work with the community, the development community, in terms of ensuring that the incentives that are offered are really economically important to those that are building affordable housing. And then, as part of the incentives, also ensure that when affordable housing is built, that is restricted and will continue to be available as affordable housing. Finally, there is a recommendation to support the resiliency goals that the affordable housing incentives be focused in your high ground areas, the city center, the neighborhood edge areas. In meeting with the advisory groups, there was some input on that, and there was some suggestions that needed to be broadened. I will mention that to you. That there needed to be other locations in the community where affordable housing would be incentivized because it is such an important issue in the community. Next slide. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, who's going to cover a couple of the last issues.
Thanks, Greg. And we'll make it quick so that we can get to your questions and get to the boards and answer any additional questions you might have. Zoning ordinances have not a great reputation, not a great history in terms of excluding people. They've often been used explicitly or implicitly to exclude certain groups from participating in the land development process. So part of what we did in the code assessment was to take the Equity in Zoning Policy Guide. That's a manual that the American Planning Association put out just a couple of years ago. To take a look at the current zoning ordinance through an equity lens and to evaluate ways in which the current zoning ordinance might be inequitable and ways that can be adjusted in the new development code. So, we looked at, rules with inequitable impacts. So, for example, material standards can have some real equity impacts because some of the materials, if they're not necessarily required for structural or other purposes, might really increase the cost of development and make it very difficult for folks to be able to develop their property. There may be development review processes which allow a lot of discretion, and that discretion can be used inequitably against certain groups. And there are also, obviously you can have zoning map standards that are inequitable as well. So for example, if you have a residential neighborhood, a residential zoning district right next to a factory, a polluting factory, well, you're going to get a certain type of housing there that's probably going to be aimed at particular groups. So if you read through the assessment, there's a lot of details about places where we have identified some of the areas where we think there can be changes in the new development code to increase its equity. Next slide. So finally, I just want to very quickly talk about the development standards. These are the standards that apply to development in the city, things such as off-street parking, landscaping, open space requirements. We've taken a close look through those, and we have a number of recommendations based on our experience working in other communities, based on our knowledge of best practices. And there's a number of recommendations in there, and you can find those on the last board over there on the left side of the room. We're recommending updates to the parking, mobility, and circulation standards. There are places where the amount of parking that's required can be adjusted to be a little bit less, we think, so that not as much of the land is devoted to parking, and also to increase the connectivity requirements to make it easier for folks to get from point A to point B, especially if they're not in a car but they're walking or using a bike. And this is linked in with some of the zoning district changes. We're recommending some neighborhood compatibility standards. So this would make sure that if you have commercial development next to a lower intensity residential development, that the development is oriented in a way to mitigate potential impacts. So for example, if it's a restaurant with a drive-through, make it so that the drive-through is oriented away from the residential neighborhood. Exterior lighting standards, we talked about open space standards, and also you all have a pretty good set of landscaping standards, but we do have some recommendations for improving those as well. Next slide. So finally, we're going to, just to let you all know what's going to happen the rest of the evening, we'll take just a few questions. We have a microphone up here, and so someone will walk around so that everybody can hear the question, and we can hear the question and make sure we answer it. We'll take a few questions that way, but then we have boards all around the room. The introductory board, which you saw as you came in, is outside, but we discuss all the different themes in the same order that we discussed them in the presentation. If you sort of walk from where you entered all the way from the right side of the room to the left side of the room. We have a couple QR codes on here. The left one takes you to the project website. And the right one, we have an online survey, which we would very much like to hear your input. It's a pretty succinct survey. It's mostly just asking for your comments on our various recommendations. You can find it easily. There's a link prominent on the website, but you can also go to that QR code. It will be available through April 25th. So you have a little bit of time. You can find the assessment on the website. We look forward to reviewing your comments as we get ready to move on to the next stage of the process. So very briefly, so we're getting public feedback on the code assessment, and we're going to take all of your input. We'll talk with staff, and we will begin drafting the city's new development code next month. So I think at this point, where's the microphone? So if you have any questions, Craig and I will take a few. Chloe there has the microphone, and we'll come around.
You mentioned with enhancing resiliency to rising water, what is the impact or the change that you're advocating for landscaping and buffering of tree, both natural systems like in stormwater ponds, as well as tree canopy to protect from the rising waters?
One thing that we have done, or we are going to be doing, is looking at your tree canopy protection standards, try to strengthen those. In terms of those stormwater management, that was just recently updated. So we are now looking at that as part of this project. I will say that one of the things we certainly will be doing is to encourage, and maybe in some instances require, low impact development techniques to be used on sites. That's something I think that would mitigate against the type of flooding that is occurring and going to occur.
When you talk about highland and lowland, with the flooding problem, you need to put in there that the stormwater basin and the drainage, when the water comes from the Ashley River, it don't come down the street from the Ashley River. It back up through the drain that the city had years ago under the city, high tide, king tide come through those areas. That's why I created the lowlands for drainage. I mean, you have upland, everything, and have 1 inch of rain. The water comes from the ash room through those areas, in those communities. But we also have to make sure that in communities, I know the city is proud of density, but we got to make sure that we take care of those Freeman cottages. And when you talk about affordable housing, you got to make sure it's a workforce housing. Because affordable housing don't mean for people that work in downtown.
Yeah, I should have said workforce housing when we talked about that issue. That's very important. In terms of the infrastructure of the city, certainly that's one of the strategies in the city plan about dealing with rising water. Certainly the zoning code doesn't, we're not dealing with design of the drainage systems, but that's something that is in the plan that the city is going to address.
Thank you. So we saw a lot of the areas that are in the natural wetland or the low impact conserved zones are also in your tidal flood risk zone and also your compound flood risk zone. And I'm curious whether there are any standards within the document that you've created that will determine which structures receive more priority in protection or adaptation versus ones that are recommended for removal and restoration of natural spaces.
There's nothing, no standards in the document. As far as I know, at least, there won't be any recommendations for removals per se. I mean, we're talking about allowing certain uses to continue, which just potentially restricting, placing limitations on those uses. There are legal constraints that we have to deal with. We are aware of.
I have a question, which is that when you were on theme 2,
Speak up.
sorry, when you were on theme 2, you were talking about legacy districts and or the lack thereof to apply for changes to the legacy districts. Could you explain a little bit more about what you were talking about with the fact that it seemed to be that you couldn't apply for any changes to legacy districts?
Sure. So the idea behind legacy districts is that, as part of the streamlining of the code, we've identified districts to consolidate, so make land that's in multiple current districts, so it will be in one new district. And there are also some districts that land is assigned to where we think that there are better districts that can accommodate the type of development that the city wants, but it may not really make sense to consolidate that district, one of the districts that we're proposing to make legacy districts, into one of the other districts. So by making it a legacy district, it means that the owners of that land can continue to develop the same way they can today. They'll have the same set of uses, the same dimensional standards, they can develop to the same intensity they can today. If they want to rezone their property, they can do that as well. But no new property can be assigned to one of those legacy districts.
I have a question. I don't need the microphone. I might be operating on urban legend here, but I've seen illustrations of a seawall that the Army Corps of Engineers might be installing in the immediate area of the Charleston Peninsula. How much of your zoning and flooding studies are coordinated with the possibility of that being installed, or are you basically treating that as something that could be, but might be more of a sort of an idea as opposed to a reality?
Staff might want to get involved in this question. I will say that, I mentioned when I showed you the city center land use categories. One thing that was prominent in that graphic was that in the lower peninsula, the city center went down through the lower peninsula. It wasn't in the high ground area, but it was one reason I believe was that that area is proposed to be armed with a wall. So.
Yeah, if I could further clarify, my name is Christopher Morgan, I'm with the City Planning Department, and the city plan assumes that the peninsula will have some sort of barrier protection. The exact height, the exact location is not determined, but the land use recommendations take that into account.
I think we'll take 2 more questions.
Hey, my name is Martin McDonald, Charleston BLM. My question is around going back to affordable and workforce housing. You're talking about different changes to the incentive to zoning for those type of housing. Is there going to be a review on the fee in lieu incentive? As there's been conversations around it not being living up to its true intention of it not really providing the city with enough affordable housing to actually, or without enough funds to actually build the affordable housing needed. So will there be a review or reform around that?
Yeah, there will be a review as part of the drafting of the regulation.
My question is similar to Marcus's in the vein of affordable housing in a state like South Carolina where inclusionary zoning is not allowed. Where do y'all look for strategies to incentivize affordable housing that works so that you get these kind of affordable new formats that you're essentially trying to incentivize in the code?
Let me make sure I understand the question. Where have we worked where there have been incentives that have really worked that result in affordable housing? First of all, I think one of the things I said in that presentation on affordable housing is there is no silver bullet answer to this. It is a tough issue. Probably the 2 places that where I have been involved that has been that incentive has been pretty successful. One is in Jackson, Wyoming, Jackson Hole. They have a serious affordable housing issue, but they actually identified several geographic areas in the community where they would allow retail development or office development to build an extra floor if it was deed restricted for affordable housing. And that worked pretty doggone well. I mean, everything that would basically was built in those geographic areas, they used that extra floor and they put in affordable housing. The other place that I've seen it work, somewhat of a similar concept, is in the city of Key West, Florida, where they did something similar to that. One of the things that I also mentioned when I was talking about developing the incentive is one of the other things we've learned about incentives is you can't have a laundry list of incentives. I think if you have 2 or 3 incentives or 4 incentives that really work, that make the construction of affordable housing much economically viable for the private sector, then you're going to start seeing a lot more affordable housing. And do we have ideas about what we've seen in other places in terms of creating those incentives? Yes, we have. But your local community, development community, and other people in the community have got to be part of that process too. They've got to tell us what they think will work. I mean, additional density will do it too. So we're going to have to work through the issue, but we are aware of the challenge, and we do have some ideas. And the other thing, you need to try to keep it as simple as you possibly can. You need to streamline that process.
Yeah, so thank you, everybody. So we will be, Craig and I and other members of the team will be stationed around around the boards to answer questions. Feel free to come up to us. Thank you so much for coming out. And don't forget, we've still got the QR codes up here for the website.